Okay, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Tonight we have an open study session. First on the agenda is CSO projects and water meter replacement. Who will be leading us on the water meter replacement?
I think we'll have John Selmy lead off.
Okay,
Yep.
Director
Hi
Selmy?
there, good evening. Yep, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good evening. So just one thing real quick though, I'd want to talk about the CSO projects and water main replacement. There's not an item specifically about the water budget, but this would ultimately all be tied to the water budget. So just so everybody knows that. So during the budget process, we had spoken about upcoming CSO projects and a water meter replacement program. In the past several months, we have met with 3 water meter replacement companies, got some baseline prices from them for some type of programs going forward. And then the CSO projects, we use the numbers of the project that was recently awarded to plug those numbers into the next 2 years' future projects. We had met several months ago, Pat Miguel and Paul Stouter. We also asked Martin from Plant Moran to join us here, John Riley and the mayor and Dan Brooks and myself, and to discuss the process going forward to fund these projects. These are, it's a big number, so we wanted to have this conversation to make sure that we're all still on the same page. So when we go to develop the water budget going forward here, we can incorporate these numbers, and then first and foremost to get the approval to go out to bond for these projects. So that's just a brief overview. I would like to maybe hand it off to John Riley or Pat Miguel and Paul. They can go into the detail of the bonding process and what that looks like. So,
John, before we do that, I mean, why don't you go through and build up the numbers about the different projects and the estimated cost, and then, so that we can kind of, till we get to the estimated bonding numbers, so that they understand the different projects and what they might cost.
Sure, I can do that. So, in the meter project, we'll start with that one specifically. We met with three vendors, 2 hours each. They presented us their products, those types of things. And we got a baseline of anywhere from $8 million to $9 million for that project to replace all the water meters, to develop the infrastructure and the backbone and the network for that project to happen. That's how we developed that number. We didn't just pull that out of thin air by any means. We spent a lot of time doing that, and then Dan did some analysis on their bids. The CSO projects, 41 and 42, I could pull those up real quick here. Dan, you got them on the top of your screen. Okay. I got them now.
I've got the numbers.
I got them.
Okay.
Yeah. So the L43 is the project that we are currently doing right now, and that bid was $3.1 million, $86,450. The engineer estimate for L42 is $5,850,000. And then the L41 is $3,030,000, which basically gives us a cost of $12 million for that, for the CSO project. If we add in the water main to those projects, if we're going to be in there doing these projects, it's my recommendation that we also do the water main at the same time. That adds another $2.5 million to that cost. Design plan updates, construction engineering, that's $1,690,000 for a total project cost of $261,650. And I did send the council all this back up on Monday. Actually, council secretary forwarded for me, so thank you. So that's how we arrived at that, and that basically takes us to about $25.3 million for those 3 projects. Then there is some issuance cost that goes along with that, and there are some thoughts on how we go forward with this. I know since I've been in this position, there's been some talk about excess CSO funds, and the team has a strategy that I think is very good. So, I mean, I think at this point, maybe John, I would hand that off to you guys.
Thank you, John.
Councilman Muscat?
Could somebody explain to me what the difference between design plan updates and construction engineering is? To me, they go hand in hand and should be one item.
Well, the design update is these plans were originally designed in 2013. All right, so we do need to take a look at them and update them to current standards. Plus,
For $371,000?
no, then
They're already there?
Well, no, and then for L42 and L41, we need to add the water main design to the plans. The water main design is not in those plans at the moment.
Well, I understand, but if something was there in 13, how much could have changed to equal out to $371,000?
Well,
Well, the water mains were not part of it.
96,000 is what we spent for 43, that's already been approved. Most of that cost is updating the plans for the water main improvements.
Well, again, I'm understanding that, but since the plans were there, how can it cost so much money just to update them?
Well, of the 371,000, 96 of it's already been allocated.
I
And
understand
then the other amount, a lot of that is on, again, we need to add the water main design to the plans. The water main designs are currently not in the plan set.
Okay, that's what that's what I was looking for. So something has to be added and re-engineered into the project.
Right.
Okay, that's what I was looking for. Thank you.
Madam Chair,
Councilman Bazey?
are we gonna go over, okay, I'm looking at the spreadsheet that Lynn sent us with the water meters. Are we discussing that now or later?
And that's next.
Well-
That's next. This is CSO first, right?
Okay, just to see it, okay. I thought we're combining.
I think that the CSO and the water meeting, they're all tied together. So the bonding is going to be for both of these projects. So, I mean, I think if you have questions about that project, it's fair to ask at this time also.
Okay, go ahead, Councilman Bazey.
Okay, so a few questions. I'm looking at, so there's 4 companies now with updating the water meters, right?
That's correct.
Okay, so with that, did you guys pick a company yet? I mean, I noticed that the one is actually cheaper than others. Is there some, reason why I'm asking, that's based on the questions I'll be asking next. I need to find out which company are you guys going with now?
So we haven't done anything yet. We need the council's approval on the bonding for the funding for this project, first and foremost. Secondly, then we would develop a RFP to go out to bid. We would bid this project out. We would vet the 4 bidders and then make a recommendation at that time. So
Okay.
this is all just preliminary work that we've done to get a baseline for a funding mechanism for future budgets and for this bond sale.
Okay, so for the future, for the RFP, I'd like to see it when it does come in front of us. So we can compare apples to apples. So if you look at the one sheet that you sent us, there's a lot of stuff on it. You got to keep back and forth going to see what is what. I mean, one of them, for example, just like say the warranty or the subscription, like somebody calls it different. One calls it annual maintenance, somebody calls it annual subscription, and one doesn't even have it in their, they say, one doesn't have that in their quote, and the other one, it says, well, for Badger, it says annual maintenance, 150,000 times 5. So
That's the fun part about these meter projects. So everybody words things different. It's a lot of work to decipher everything to get it to apples. This is a lengthy task to do, and we've laid some of that groundwork. So, we have some ideas of vendors that we would like to go with, but we need to make sure that ultimately, this is a 30-year investment, right? These meters should last the city for 30 years, and then we're talking about building a network that these meters read to. So there's still a lot of work to do. This is just preliminary for you to look at some numbers, for us to get the baseline for you to, if we say $8 to $9 million, you can see where we're coming up with these numbers. That's what this is for.
Okay, thanks. I appreciate it, but I want to make sure. I mean, just voicing my concerns now. So when it does come in front, I don't ask the same questions. So I'd like to see. I mean, we have 5 years. You mentioned it's a 30-year program. I'd like to see, for let's say additional years, how much it would be as well, because these guys could be cheap, for 5 years. But if we go another 5 years, it might be double the cost. So I'd like to see what it would be for, let's say, the next 20 or 25 years for additional years. It won't include it on the quote, but so we can see what the difference is.
Yeah.
That's one.
Maybe I misspoke a little bit. So this is going to be a 12 to 15 month build. The longevity of the system is going to be for 30 years. So all these costs are basically upfront, except for some of the maintenance costs, which include the collectors and some of the technology that's the backbone of this project.
Okay, the last question on that one. I've been doing some research. There's some areas especially with what we have, the systems that we have, they're not tamper-proof, and I know somebody can bypass meters. So I'd like to see in the future ones, the ones we're going to spend that much money for, if they have like tamper-proof, make sure that nobody can mess with them or tamper or bypass them.
Right. So all these systems here have tamper alarms built into them. They have no flow, reverse flow. If the meter's removed, these are highly technical type meters nowadays. That technology's been around for a while, so they have a bunch of tamper alarms already built into them.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Any other questions?
Madam Chair.
Councilman Abdullah?
So I had a couple questions, John. First of all, as far as the companies is there any particular company here that you guys have worked with that you are comfortable with?
So currently the city is working with Ferguson Supply Neptune meters. Neptune meters has been around for a very long time, American-made product. I think most of these are American-made nowadays anyways, but so the city does have an established relationship with Neptune. So there would be some additional value going with Neptune because as we replace meters, they still have a good useful life. That could save us, upwards of several $100,000 by just switching ahead in how we collect that read and not changing the body. So, but short answer, yes, Ferguson Supply.
Okay. Second question I had for you is there's a pretty drastic difference between each company. I mean, we're talking about on a high of 8.922, we're talking about like basically 9 million to a low of 7.6 million. That's a huge difference. We're talking about almost $1.5 million difference, which is about 15-20% difference in prices. Is that common at this level? Because it doesn't seem like it would be that much of a difference typically.
Well, this is not a bid, so we just asked the vendors to share numbers if they wanted to, right?
Okay, so just approximate.
They're not putting their cards on the table, I guess I would say, right?
Makes sense.
They did this. I reached out to them, and they did this in good faith. I mean, these are not numbers that would be bid, right? These are just for reference. I mean, I guess when it comes out to time to go to bid, everybody's gonna sharpen their pencil one way or the other.
It makes sense. It makes sense. Okay, and then the last question I had for you, if you don't, I'm sorry.
I just
No, go ahead.
comment on the Badger bid or Badger numbers. They did not provide some of the costs for the larger meters and the installation of the larger meters.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why their price is only
They're quite a bit
7.6.
less. Looking at it, 7.6.
I inputted kind of an average cost for those meters, and it makes their bid come to about 8.5 million.
I see.
So that number is
Makes it
low
much more
because they
in line-
didn't
makes it
provide
much
us
more
with
in
some
line.
of the information.
Okay. And the last question I had for Director Selmy is, one of the biggest challenges that we're having right now is with different residents complaining about their water bills. And I'm not just referencing the last call that we had at the last meeting. this is something that's somewhat ongoing, fortunately or unfortunately, true or untrue, but it does come up a lot. Is this something that, that these new meters, is this something that will much better minimize the chances of error, accuracy, et cetera, to eliminate the high water bills that a lot of clients are getting? As a matter of fact, I mean, just over the weekend, I was over to somebody's house casually for an engagement, and they themselves again mentioned, and then there was like, you know, different people started bringing it up, how the water bills are coming too high in Dearborn Heights. So will this most likely either eliminate it or minimize it? Thank you.
Well, this will not reduce their water bill. This will make an accurate water bill. These meters will be read every day, not by, you know, they send reads to a collector. We can get that data and break it down in 5-minute data. Some of the beauty of this is that it has a customer service tool, so where actually you can have an app where the resident can log in and see their usage on a daily basis, on an hourly basis. They can program exceptions in there. There's a lot of tools, somewhat similar to if you, like the DT Energy app, something along those lines. But if you Google the water apps, there's the same type of thing. So they can manage their water system. They can manage their water use. If they use, say they want to use more than 100 gallons per day, they can set an alarm and it'll come to their phone. So there's a lot of value in here. It's got a lot of great customer service tools, you know. That's my opinion.
Then quick lead-in question, if that's the case. If somebody's got a potential leak, does that have any way of assessing it or catching it or anything along the lines of that?
Yep, it has leak detection. It does have leak detection in there. So if you exceed so many gallons per day or per hour, whatever you set that threshold at, it will send you an alert through an app or an email or a text.
Good, nice. Okay, thank you.
Councilman Muscat, you had your hand up.
Yes, what concerns me is we get into these smart meters. And the way technology moves, in 5 years, are we going to be obsolete and hit with another big bill of starting all over again with the way we record all the water meters? You know, it bothers me to think that, because that's the same thing happens with our 911 dispatch. You spend a lot of money, and all of a sudden they say, hey, we can't support you anymore.
Yeah. So I would answer that from my profession, that the answer would be absolutely not. 15 years ago, I would have said yes. I did this program in another community about 5-7 years ago. We purposely waited 5 to 6 years until the technology leveled out and that we would never have that happen to us. The way this is set up now, they're all doing it the same way. One of the only big differences right now is some are using a cellular backhaul, which would be, in my opinion, risky, versus building your own data collection. So that would be the only two things. But the technology and the meters, those aren't going away or anytime soon.
Thank you.
Thank you. I have Councilman Constant.
Thank you, Madam Chair. John, so the Ferguson, that's the same Ferguson that has the Ferguson supply over on Van Born, not too far from the DPW yard?
I think so. They're a national company now that plumbing wholesale, that type of stuff. The Neptune meter distributor here in Michigan was Michigan Meter, and Ferguson purchased them and brought them underneath their umbrella to have the distributorship of Neptune meters.
And then as far as transmittal, any radiation or anything like that, that's very minimal as far as the transmitting of the data from these meters to...
So the technology that we'd use the same type of technology that we have now. The meter in the basement, it's hardwired to the outside of the home just like it is now, and the data transmitter would be on, actually the battery would be on the side of the home sending the read. The only difference being right now we walk up to the home and plug a computer into a box. The difference being now that box would send that read to our collector and to our servers. And it's hard from the meter to the outside, it's hardwired with telephone wires, so there's no stray, whatever you want to call it.
All right, thank you.
I have a question.
Welcome.
How long does the average battery last on those before they need to be replaced?
So 10 years. Actually, they're guaranteed for 20. fully guaranteed 10, and then they're prorated after 10. It would be my recommendation. In my former, where we did this before, we put like a penny, 1 cent or 2 cent in the rate, and had a set aside fund, just a fund for batteries in 10 to 12 years, because they do start to wear out. But the first 10 years is 100%, and after that, they're prorated.
Now, so how much does the batteries cost? Do we have any idea?
You know, I want to say $60, $70.
Okay, that's not bad.
So if you fund it with a penny or two in the rate, you know, you've always got that money in there. You're not, you know, looking to find a way to, and 10,000 batteries aren't going to die at once either, because you're not going to install 10,000 meters on the same day, right? So they're going to slowly get installed over time, you know, over 12 to 15 months. So, but when they do start to do that, you know, my recommendation would be to put a penny or two in the rate so you have a fund for that.
Thank you. Any further questions?
Just one item. Am I unmuted? Back in the beginning of the city, they bought Badger meters. And then in 1989, we went out for bids for meters, and we went to the Neptune meters. So we have had a history of the Badger and the Neptune. And the reason we went from Badger to the Neptune meters was because they were a considerably cheaper cost. And that was why the city fathers made the decision at that time.
Thank you. Any further questions or concerns? Okay, well, thank
So,
you.
Madam Chair?
Yes?
Okay, so, you know, I guess what John was doing was outlining the cost of all, and you know, the large amount of cost of all these projects. We have the 3 CSOs and then the meter. And now, you know, how will we pay for that? And the discussions have been the bonding. And so, you know, we've had a meeting back in February of the bond council, the consultant, and Martin. And then we also had John and the mayor. And then today, Linda Vance was on a second conversation. But that, you know, if we're going to go ahead and do these federally mandated projects and also include in the new water meters, that we're going to have to issue bonds for those. And so, yeah, and the amount is going to be in excess of the $25,300,000 because we also have, there's a cost to issue the bonds. And then, so I'm going to turn it over to Pat, who can kind of talk about the bonding process, but then also, hopefully we can also include in that conversation how the structure of the bonds will be paid out over time and how that will fit into the water budget, as you guys will be shown that as it comes later this year.
Thank you. Is there any?
Pat?
Go ahead.
Yeah, this is Pat Miguel. So for those of you that know me, I am a bond attorney and I've worked with the city on your various capital financings for a number of years. So as John laid out, we have talked about this project and the best ways to finance it. And really there's a couple different components here because we have 3 separate CSO projects as well as a water meter project. A recommendation is to combine the projects into a single type of bond, which we would do as a capital improvement bond. That capital improvement bond means that it would be issued by the city in an amount necessary to pay the cost of the various projects, the engineering, the issuance costs. And that capital improvement bond would be payable as a limited tax general obligation of the city. This is similar to other financings that the city has done where the city essentially pledges its full faith and credit as security, although in this case, the repayment of the bonds would come from a couple different sources. So as many of you know, the city voters many years ago in 1997 approved a millage specifically to pay debt service on bonds issued for CSO projects. And many of those bonds have since been retired and the city still has some funds remaining from that millage. It's important to note, and we've discussed this over the last several years, that that money cannot be used directly to pay for the construction of CSO projects. It can only be used to pay debt service on bonds issued for CSO projects. So the idea is that we would be including the CSO projects in the bond issue and then be able to use that millage, which has not been collected for several years now, but is sitting there and was really only available and should best be used to pay debt service on bonds for CSO projects. So that's why we're looking to do a bond issue, which would include all 3 of the CSO projects, including the one that's expected to start here this summer. And that will allow you to be able to use that CSO millage to pay for part of that. The remaining amount of debt service on the bonds is going to come from rates and charges generated by users of the system. And we would also propose including the meter replacement program in that, so that it's all in one bond issue, which leads to some efficiencies in scale and cost and everything else. So the process for doing this is really kind of a 2-step process at the city council level relating to the bonds. The first step in the process is for the city council to adopt a notice of intent resolution. And that is a resolution that says that the city intends to issue bonds to pay for these projects in an amount not to exceed X dollars. And then it provides that the bonds would be a limited tax general obligation of the city and can be issued without a vote of the people unless a referendum petition is signed and submitted to the city clerk within 45 days of the publication of a notice, which is signed by at least 10% of the registered voters. So this process is very similar for a lot of other types of bond issues where there is sort of a referendum right. And that is why it's the first step in the process. And this resolution, we have a draft of it with some blanks yet to complete. But the idea is that we could present this to the council at your next meeting on June 23rd to consider the approval of this resolution, which would then authorize us to begin the process for setting up the financing. So the second step in the process would be several months later, as we're getting closer to the issuance of the bonds. We would then come back to the city council and ask for a resolution authorizing the issuance of the bonds. At that point, the exact amount of the bond issue would be determined, or the parameters for that, and then we would proceed to issue and sell the bonds. So the first step here would be the notice of intent, which has a broad, what I call a not to exceed amount, which then we would go back to the council later to further refine that. The initial step is really to kind of get the parameters. Now, I'm going to turn it over to Paul Stoddard in a minute to talk a little bit about the structuring, but I will say from a legal standpoint, what we usually recommend is to not use just the current estimate that you have for the projects. Right now, those are based upon a contingency has been built in and some cost escalation. But as we've seen in the last couple of years, costs on these projects can be uncertain. We would recommend increasing that number by adding another contingency so that if the bids came in higher when received, we wouldn't have to go through that notice of intent step process again. So ultimately, the council will decide at a later date what the actual amount of the bonds would be. But our recommendation would be to do something bigger than right now. If you add up the 3 CSO projects and the water meter project, we're looking at somewhere near $25.3 million. The number that I had in my head, adding another 10% plus issuance costs, would put that somewhere a little bit above $28 million. Again, but that doesn't mean that you would have to issue that amount, but it would allow you to get that initially authorized and then come back later to decide what the actual amount of the bond issue would be. So the other thing that we've talked about, and you have obviously 4 different projects with different timetables. So one of the things that we would also be working on over the coming months would be determining whether it makes sense to issue all the bonds up front this year, or whether we would do a subsequent issue later. And I'll let Paul Stoddard talk a little bit about those considerations. I will say that part of the process and planning has been to work with Martin Olenek from Plant Moran and Paul Stoddard from Public Financial Management, the financial advisor, to make sure that the rate structure of the city is built to accommodate that. And I know you've done a lot of work on that and talked about that quite a bit over the last several months and several years. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Paul, and then to talk a little bit more about the structure of the financing, what the bond market is like right now, and the anticipated cost of this, and then we can address any questions about the bond financing together after that. So Paul, can you take it from there?
Yeah, thanks, Pat. In order to try to reduce the downstream payments on any borrowing that the city does for this project, the idea here is to issue, let's say 26 million, give or take, for the purposes of these projects, but to create a payment on the bonds in the first year that would be around $4 million, which is about equivalent to the amount of money that the city has collected over the years for CSO projects. And by doing that, then the remainder of the loan is going to be much less over the amortization period. Just in very round numbers, if we did a structure like that, the remaining payments over a 20-year term would be about $1.5 million a year, which, you know, we understand your finance department, you know, can work into the rate structure and not really create a significant impact to the utility ratepayers. We are not at this point certain, as Pat indicated, as to what the final amount of any borrowing might be. So we might suggest that the city go through the referendum process and initially issue an amount of bonds that we certainly know is going to be required for the projects. We have very, very favorable interest rates on the market right now. We are seeing 20-year financings getting done in the 2.25% to 2.5% range, which is a tremendously low borrowing cost for a 20-year loan. So we would, I think, encourage the city to borrow as much capital as absolutely know is going to be spent for the project. And then possibly next year, when we know the final costs, do a subsequent borrowing if that was required. But knowing at that point that we've locked in a very, very low borrowing cost for the majority of the program. It's oddly enough a very, very good time to borrow and very low cost of borrowing.
Okay, thank you. Councilman Muscat.
You know, I'm getting a little bit of a mixed feeling here, and we do this construction, and we're going to do it in phases. Obviously, we can't do all of these projects at one time at 1 year. So when someone quotes us these prices are going to be locked in. It's not going to go up $500,000 in 4 years when you start another project, will it?
Dan, are you going to answer that? I mean,
Well, the CSO 42 is going to be bid toward the end of this year, which is the larger project, which is about $9 million. The CSO 41, we won't bid that until 2022. And then the meter replacement, we intend to have that bid by end of this year or early next year.
So how are we going to know what the final price is then? I mean,
Well,
we're going to borrow money up front.
by the end of the year, we'll know. We'll have a good idea what we have the L42 bids in. We have the meter replacement bids in. The only one that we won't have bids in is L41, which is about $3.6 million. So
Well,
we
how
got.
much of that could change though? That's what I'm, you know, if those prices go up, then we're going to have to borrow more money.
Well, that was a part of having there's some contingencies built in these numbers already for a price increase. All right. So.
And how much is that?
There's right now 5%. But like I said before, this time next year or early 21, we'll know basically $22 million of the 26. We'll know what the prices are.
So what happens to the other money then if money's left over? Is it just going to sit in a bank account like this other CSO project money is going to be that we have sitting there? I mean, it's money that taxpayers are going to pay, and it's just going to sit there if it's left over. That's what I'm afraid of.
Dan, let's
If I could address that, Councilman. So our expectation is that we wouldn't do this in a way that has money left over. So I think, as Dan was just saying, we have prices on the water meters. We have prices and bids on the L43. So those costs are relatively certain. The project L42 would be bid later this year. So I think our expectation would be that even though, let's say we ask for a number higher than what the estimate is, that we might not borrow that full amount this year. But I think what Paul Stoddard was suggesting is if we think the number with the projects we know is $26 million, we would issue bonds for $26 million this year. And then if it turns out that when those other projects are bid with change orders, if it did come in higher, we would have a little bit extra room and cushion that we could issue a bond later at the end of 2021 or 2022 that would cover those costs. So our intent is not to have a large number that we borrow and have money left over. The idea would be that we would be basing that on the bids that we have in hand and the projections. But the reason for asking for a larger not to exceed amount at this point is that if the bids did come in higher, whether this fall for project 42 or whether next year for project 41, we wouldn't have to repeat this first step with the notice of intent resolution. So ultimately, council is going to get to decide at a later meeting what that actual bond amount would be. And again, as we get into this program a little bit, we can figure out whether we'll have the L42 bids before that or not. So, but yes, I think your point is a good one. We're not talking about putting a bigger number in here right now and expecting to have that money and have it sit and borrow too much. We're talking about having the ability to ask for bonds in that amount if it turns out we need more than the current projected $25.3 million. So we're really trying to do this in a way that minimizes having to go back and repeat steps with notices and preliminary proceedings that would add time to the process.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any further questions before we move on?
One question. I think it's important, and I totally concur that the way this debt is being set up, that the amount, and I don't recall exactly how much, I think it was $2 or $3 million that was over collected on millages from a previous debt holding will all be used up front, which would then be able to get paid as Pat has indicated against debt. So that decreases the overall cost of the interest expense over the bonding period. And am I right in assuming that after that first year, then all those excess funds are gone?
I think that's really a question for Paul, but I believe that was our intent, was to structure it so we would use up that CSO millage very quickly.
Yeah, and that's what my hope is. So I want to make it clear that that would be my intent anyway.
Yeah, and that will reduce the annual payments going forward. So apply those funds and lower your payments out into the future.
Excellent.
As of last year in June, the amount was roughly $4 million.
Okay.
Any further comment? Okay, at this time, let's move
Madam
on.
Chair, if I could, Martin, would you mind taking a few minutes? Because in previous water budgets, we've kind of projected some of these bond payments, and under this new circumstance, it seems like the bond payments are going to be a little bit more because it's going to include the meter project and all that. What the effect on the water rates would be, if you could just kind of like touch on that a little bit. Of, you know, I know it's not specific, but like on an overall, like on a looking down at it kind of.
Yeah, so this will be based on last year's model, the June 30, 2019 model that was looked over by the council. I believe the meeting was in November or December. And what we did when we were working with the city, we were projecting actually a 15 million, 1.5 bonding for this. So instead of the 20, let's just say 25. So it does seem like a significant difference. But what we were utilizing in the tables was a 4% interest rate. I guess one of the very few things that came out of that's good from the pandemic is the interest rates plummeted. So by increasing from 15 million to 25 million, our projections showed 1.1 million principal and interest payments for 20 years in the model. This goes up to about 1.5, 1.6. So even though the dollar amount of the bonds is significantly higher, the payments themselves are not proportionally increased because the interest rate is so much less. This is historical lows, which definitely benefit the city tremendously. So that's one. If you do go up in the to the from the 1.1 to roughly 1.5, 1.6 million, it does increase the need to increase overall water and sewer rates, but it's not multiple percentage points. So for every, just looking at cash at the end of 5 years, in order to generate about $3 million worth of cash, the water and sewer rates have to go up by 1%. So having those principal and interest payments go up, let's just say $500,000 or $600,000 per year, based on these numbers, you're probably looking at about 1% increase in water and sewer rates on an annual.
1%?
1%. But again, this is based on these numbers. So there's other things that come into play. For example, you know, some of the costs, other costs, you know, water costs, sewage treatment costs, and things like that. If those change, clearly the rates may not be the same. But if we're just basing it off of the 6/30/2019 numbers, we'd be looking at a 1% increase. So last year, again, I believe it was in December, the proposed increase overall for rates was, I want to say, approximately 5 or 6%. That would have been 6 or 7% instead. I don't know if that kind of answers your question, Treasurer Riley.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I think it kind of, you know, it kind of takes us full circle when we're talking about additional bonding, how much the additional monthly rate would be on paying off those bonds, and then how would that affect the rate structure? Because there's two things we want to do. We want to use the CSO funding up front so that we get clear out that issue, and then you have, you know, how will the rates be affected going into the future to pay for this excess debt? Mainly because now you're adding in there the water meters, to the replacement of the water meters.
Now, one thing that I do want to be completely transparent on, when I say 1%, it's 1% each year. So if the projection was, you know, let's just say 3% per year increase every year, it would have been actually 4%. It's not just a one-time 1% increase. If that makes sense.
Any other discussion? Oh, Councilman Muscat?
I kind of lost my train of thought there on all of this money being thrown around like it's water. I mean, $25.3 million, that's $26 million. And question is since this is federally mandated, don't we get anything from Washington or Lansing on this? I mean, if they're mandating that we do this, I thought when they mandated something, we get some aid. Can anyone answer that?
There's no grants out there for this work.
Well, how can they mandate something if the city couldn't possibly afford it?
Well,
if I can add one thing too, the water meter is not a mandated thing, okay? So that's
that I understand.
Right. So just so we don't lump that together, that's all. You know, the CSO projects are a different thing.
The other thing is there's a federal mandated Clean Water Act, and the fact of the matter is when you have combined sewer overflows, you're in violation of the Clean Water Act, and that's pushing a lot of this. The other thing I will tell you, Councilman, is that over 10 years ago, we were mandated to do all the CSOs in the city of Dearborn Heights, and we've been able to put this project off for the 10 years. And part of the rationale and the reason was that we knew the FICAN's debt would be coming off in year 2020. So in order to help our ratepayers, we've got debt coming off with this new debt coming on, and it minimizes the impact on rates. But we actually benefited in some regards on some of the CSOs as a result of the city of Detroit going through its bankruptcy. But Inkster took care of these these overflows in their section of the town about 7 or 8 years ago, and I questioned what they were doing. In fact, they were asking us to do the same work at the same time. And then if you remember, the Inkster water rates just escalated through the ceiling. And we held off and did not, and we managed to convince the state to hold off on mandating these particular projects. But that ability to hold it off has ended. There's no rational reason that the state's going to accept for us not doing these projects. But we really are in violation, as I understand, of the Clean Water Act.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Any further discussion? Oh, Councilman Constant, I'm sorry.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My first question is for Martin. So Martin, you're saying, for example, to raise 3 million, it would be $1 million, it would be 1% a year, each year for 3 years?
It's so the model is a 5-year model. The last year's model was projecting approximately 6% increases every year for water and sewer. So instead of the 6%, it would actually be 7% to raise the $3 million.
So we're talking about over a 5-year period.
Correct. So the model, the city always looks 5 years ahead, which is an excellent basis. Some cities look only 1 year ahead, which that triggers a lot of ups and downs and rates, and because clearly there's some big projects at one point or another. The city of Dearborn Heights always looks at 5 years ahead, which provides a little bit more of a smoothing effect as a result.
And to further answer what Councilman Musket said, that when I was state rep, the city of Inkster did get a hardship exception for certain sewer improvements. And then a lot of things sort of hit all together. And Inkster has a real problem with someone properly assessing and collecting their taxes and their water bills. And the water bills went way up and nobody knew exactly what they owed. There was a big protest. Some of you may remember it was in the news because people were getting huge water bills. And that's something that we really want to avoid. Inkster's a smaller city population-wise than we are. And so it was even more of a dramatic increase for the residents of Inkster.
Madam Chair,
Oh, go ahead.
I guess what I'd like to say, one benefit, and maybe John or Dan could talk about this, is, installing those new water meters, part of that goal is to remove the loss that we're having in the system. I think there's a certain percentage, and I don't know why 14% is coming into my head, of water that we're being billed by Detroit that we're not able to bill to our residents. And so that water is being lost either by these old meters or by people tampering with the meters. So by installing these new meters, I think that hopefully we'll be able to get the revenue for some of that lost water that we're not billing anybody for at this point, which, is rightfully so. And so I'll kind of defer that to, John or Dan, if that kind of logic is making sense.
And by the way, Treasurer O'Reilly, last year's water loss was 14.7%. So you were spot on.
Thank you.
Right, this program, the goal is to get that water loss down below less than 10%. All right. So you got 5% more water revenue coming in that you may not have now.
Madam Chair.
Okay. Councilman Bazey?
Okay, so if we're going to be charging, residents, for the CSO fund, is there going to be a mechanism to prevent what happened in the past, keep overcharging residents when we get what we need for the project?
Can you answer that, Councilman? So right now there's the surplus revenues from prior tax collection. That's going to be used right up front to pay off these bonds in the initial years. We're not going to the taxpayers to pay for the rest of the bonds. It's going to be paid through rates. So there will be no surplus like there was with the CSO surplus for tax collection.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any further discussion?
Madam Chair.
Councilman Abdullah?
So I had a question. I'm not sure if this question is answered by Martin or by John Riley. The rates that we have that are available right now are just unbelievably low, whether it's for real estate or for this. This is going to be locked in for us, obviously, for the whole term of the bond. It's not an adjustable rate; it's a fixed rate. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So is it not advantageous then for us to do this now versus next year? Because as you are just as aware, a lot of times just before major elections, presidential elections, they tend to keep the interest rates low because it looks good for the economy and all that. Whereas next year, when COVID is gone, the elections are gone, there's a high likelihood they're going to raise the rates. Wouldn't this be much more advantageous for us to do this right now versus possibly next year?
I believe so, and that's why we're coming with you with this now, and that to get the majority of the bonding done up front. Because I think if you could do it in one, number one, you'll have it in the low interest rate, and
Right.
number two, if it's one bonding, you won't have two cost of issuances if you end up having to have a second series. So I would say, kind of be generous with that first bonding because it's going to cost you more to do a second bonding because you might either have a higher interest rate or a second cost of issuance.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any further discussion? At this time, let's move forward. Next on the agenda is the water budget.
Madam Chair, yeah, so this prior discussion was related to the water budget. There's really not much of a conversation for the water budget. We were just looking for some direction about going forward with these bonds so that we can develop the budget and get it to the council here next month or so.
Okay, fine. At this point,
Madam Chair, I think just to clarify, so next Tuesday on the 23rd, I put a spot holder for the council to put on there the notice of intent resolution for the capital improvement bonds. That's what Patrick was talking about earlier. So, we're going to put a number, and I think one thing is we should say what that number should be, and then have the council approve that so that the voters or the residents would have time to challenge this, us issuing these bonds. But then later on, again, as the bids come in, we'll actually size the bonds at a lower amount than what's in the notice of intent. Is that right, Patrick?
Correct. Yes, that's correct. The idea would be we would come to the commission or council next week with that. I don't know that we have necessarily decided on the number yet, but that would be an action item for the city council next week for consideration of approval of that notice of intent resolution.
So, Patrick, so you and Paul do this, all the time. We at Dearborn Heights issue bonds maybe every 4 or 5 years. So, I mean, so what would be your recommendation with everything that we've discussed back in February, again today, and here at today's meeting? What would you recommend?
So I'll give you my legal answer, and ultimately, I think from a legal standpoint, I like to know that when we do the notice of intent resolution, we don't have to go back if projects come in a little higher than anticipated. And with engineering costs, they do a great job estimating those, but prices change. And sometimes we see price increases that were unforeseeable. So I like to use a number that's bigger than what we think we need, but not so big that it scares people. So, we're talking about some big numbers here, but if we look at a $25 million project cost, and I think Dan had included a 5% contingency and escalation, and my thought would be that I would want to have at least another 10% contingency cost buffer in there and include money for issuance costs as well. So, my math has that coming out somewhere between 28 and 29 million. I don't know if Paul was able to run numbers necessarily this afternoon or if he has a different thought, but I would feel better if we had another 10% construction contingency built into it, because at least half of this project is still not been bid, and we don't really know that those numbers are going to come in at that same level when they are bid. So Paul, do you have a thought on what that number should be?
Paul?
He's muted. He's muted, Paul. We can't hear you.
Yeah. There.
You couldn't hear me. I said 50 million.
Oh, get out.
No, I would, yeah, I would bump it up 10%. I think round numbers, I would put it at 29 million. And then when we get to issuing the bonds and have real cost in hand, we'll back it down from there.
So the resolution that will be before the council, if we put in the 29 million, that doesn't mean we have to issue bonds for $9 million, but that we have that a limit available. No
Yeah.
bonding can take place until we come back to the city council. Is that
Yeah.
Yeah, and I would, right,
City
and John,
Yeah, city council would approve any amount that is actually issued.
And I would add that what that does by having a number larger than what we think we need is that if it does come in higher, we wouldn't have to go back and repeat this first step. But in any case, the actual bond size would be set by the city council, and hopefully we would have better numbers at that point. And so that's why we're looking for authorizing at the initial stage a not to exceed amount number, which is hopefully going to be larger than what we actually end up issuing.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I guess you'll see that notice of intent resolution on the agenda for the 23rd. And, so if there's any questions, please feel free to reach out to us.
Okay. Well, thank you. And last item on the agenda is local and major streets budget.
Madam Chair, is it okay we excuse Pat and Paul? I don't think, these guys need to stay for this part of it. They took care of the bonding and so we appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, next, local and major street budget.
I'll let John Salmi talk about it, but it's as depressing as depressing can get.
Okay.
Well, I can speak to the projects. I know Linda's on here, so she may be, or Martin's still here. Did Martin stay or no? Did Martin go?
Yes.
And Martin's still on. So I can give a brief overview. We spoke a month ago or so, whatever it was, about this budget. I don't want to speak out of school here, but the revenues didn't come in as anticipated. We put together a budget for next year's road projects, and you'll see on the page or tab 3, I guess it is. We had a bunch of projects out there that we wanted to do, but the funding's not coming in from the Act 51 monies. Obviously, probably due to the COVID, lowest gas prices in the modern era, and nobody driving cars. So, but as far as the budget goes, if Linda or Martin could touch to that, and then I can touch on the project specific.
So I can go on a high level. The very first page of the document, it kind of shows the forecast numbers for next year with gas and weight tax, just the Act 51 revenue. It is projected in total between major and local streets to be about $1 million lower than this past year, based on correspondence that we received from the state. Now the actual, we don't know what's really going to happen. We're definitely hoping the economy rebounds much quicker, but as of right now, the projections are about $1 million lower. So it's clearly very substantial. Majority of the expenses in the major and local streets are construction related. The other expenses that exist, some administration, small numbers, traffic services and other things, we're projecting basically inflationary increases. So majority of the budget is definitely driven by the construction that's projected by the city and what's needed in the city. And that's on page 3 of the document. And it lists out all the projects that are hope to be prepared and done over next year, but you'll see that there's many notes that they have to be delayed until next year or the following year or even after that because there's just not enough funds in the major and local streets.
Any questions? Councilman, yeah.
Are any of those roads that we want to do gonna be in the CSO areas where they're gonna get a new road anyway?
No.
No.
No. The new roads in the CSO areas are covered under the CSO costs.
Yeah, I understand it, but I mean, any roads that need to be rebuilt or anything, streets need to rebuild, are they in one of those areas where we could actually save some money because they're gonna be done anyway? We could
No.
take them off the list, right?
No. There isn't a single road that is included. Unfortunately, it doesn't help us.
All right, I just throwing it out there for a little food for thought, though.
So what the projects are that we're proposing to do on the local streets is Lila Lane from Beach Daily to Wilson, and then Kinmore, Arnold, Lockdale, and Nightingale, south of Ann Arbor Trail, around the church over there. Those roads have met their life expectancy and then some. Southfield Service Drive, Annapolis to Van Born, on the right lane there, and then do some bridge deck replacement there or repairs. There's a big speed bump there. You're going across that deck there, and if you're not going slow enough, you get airborne. And then some maintenance projects, some striping projects on Ann Arbor Trail from Evergreen to Inkster Road, some seal crack, joint sealing, and some smaller projects along those lines. And you will see, like Martin referenced there is, a bunch of other projects that we identified that we wanted to do this year, but the revenues obviously didn't come in. And also on a suggestion from Plant Moran and Martin that we budget a little bit more conservative because those numbers could even come in a little bit less. So then we have taken that into consideration also.
Okay. Any other questions or concerns? Well, I guess that concludes our study session. Thank you, everyone. Do we have any public comment before I close this meeting out? Mr. Zuhair Abdelhak?
Yes.
You go ahead.
Good evening, everyone, and I'm speaking as a resident, just to clarify. Now, that's for David. Anyway, the meters, are they the cause of losing the water at this rate, or there is something else in the city causing the loss of that much percentage? And if we change, John, please, if we change those meters, are we expecting to reduce the loss from 13 or 12% to a lot less than that?
I think the short answer is a combination of multiple things. Meters that under register, an aging water system. We are doing a lot of water main improvement. Another component to this is pressure issues from the Great Lakes Water Authority, which we have been working with the authority to help manage our water main break issues. We are installing some pressure sensors downstream of some of their meter pits so we can analyze their pressures. They cause us a lot of heartburn from time to time. So in the big picture, it's a combination of multiple things. But the number one thing for sure is you need an accurate meter. If I'm making Coca-Cola and I don't know how much I'm selling because I don't know how to meter it, those are important things there. And will it cure the whole issue? No. But will it contribute to it? Yes.
Wouldn't you think the priority should be to change the older pipes which are breaking, from time to time and causing lots of water to go underground? It's more important than changing the meters at this time.
Well, we have 20,000 plus customers that are using water. A broken water main is not going to equal that amount. And the city has aggressively been replacing water main over the years. And since I've been here, they've continued to be aggressive about it. And we are identifying the areas, where that needs to happen. So.
Do you have any idea?
And your meters are 30 years old too. That's the bigger thing, right? Your meters
I have no problem with changing them. Actually, I would like to see newer meters where, you know, they cannot be overridden somehow and people use water without paying for it. But I would like really to see some calculation how much water we lose from the breakage and how much water we lose by not charging the customers because of the meters. If anybody can have that kind of calculation to see where our priority should be.
Okay,
Madam Chair.
any other
Madam Chair,
woman? This is public comment.
I had a question, but I didn't get the floor earlier. So do I not ask a question?
Go ahead.
My question is about the water meters from previous budgets. The previous water budgets we had approved there, and I have it in my notes, I was reviewing the previous budgets. We were advised that water rate increases were necessary to accommodate purchasing those water meters. Can you tell us how many have been purchased and how many have been replaced in homes?
I'm sorry, is that for me? I don't,
for you.
I mean,
Yes,
I've only been
please.
here for one, I've only been here for one budget, so, I mean, I don't really know. I mean, when meters go bad, we replace them, you know, I don't have the number on the top of my head right now, you know, it's not thousands, I can assure you.
Okay.
20, 30, 40, 50, something along those lines. I mean, I don't, you know,
Okay.
but we have a meter repair budget, you know, and those types of things in there.
Right. My thought was, though, because of the water budget discussions that had come up where, you know, we needed this water rate increase to accommodate purchasing, because this was in discussion for a few years now about replacing these water meters, because we can all agree that the water meters that we have now on homes are slowing down. We are losing water count, and it does impact what the city ends up paying. So I'm just trying to follow up on that from previous years.
Okay.
I got one more.
I'm going to unmute him now.
Got him.
Yeah. Mr. Drapkowski, can you please unmute yourself?
Here he goes. Oh, no.
Oh. There.
Is it there?
There you go.
My question is, when a house goes up for sale and it's inspected, why aren't the meters replaced then? Can that be done?
Well, I'm not sure what your question is, but if we're going to change the meters, we need to change them all in a time frame, because we're also talking about not just the meter itself, but how we collect the reads, how we bill those reads, all those types of things. There's a whole new process, a whole new infrastructure, a whole new background. So just, you know, to piecemeal it, I don't think you get a much value for your dollar there.
Okay, that was just one of my questions. And also, you had brought up Ann Arbor Trail. Is there going to be anything done with the Beach Daily bridge? Because it looks pretty rough. And I've been in a resident for over 40 some years, and I've never seen anything done with it.
So on Beach Daily or on Ann Arbor Trail?
The Ann Arbor Trail going over Beach Daily.
Yeah, so the beach, to the best of my knowledge right now, is the Beach Daily Bridge itself going underneath Ann Arbor Trail. Is that what you're speaking about?
Correct.
That's probably a Wayne County jurisdiction road there. You know, so I don't know if they have any plans here in the near future to do anything with that, but we certainly can reach out to them.
The bridge is under Wayne County jurisdiction. The surface, Ann Arbor Trail surface is under the Dearborn Heights jurisdiction, but the bridge itself is Wayne County.
Okay,
Well,
so is the bridge going to be resurfaced anytime?
We have money in the budget for some bridge maintenance. I'll have to see if that's one of the projects.
Okay, thank you.
Although the road underneath the bridge is in very bad shape, I have brought this to the attention of the county, numerous
Correct.
times, but the way you drive in the lanes, you hit those hard
Potholes.
parts of the road with your tires. You can't avoid it, and that needs to be fixed.
Right. That whole area needs resurfacing.
Agreed, totally.
Any more public comment? Looks like we're done. Thank you, everyone, and you have a good night.
Everybody have a
Good night.
good evening.
Thank you. Have a great night.